Okay, it's 1:30 and we're going to reconvene the September 10th meeting of the San Luis Obispo County Planning Commission. If the folks in the back of the room could maybe shut the doors so that we don't get distracted by the conversations outside the room. Before we take up where we left off on item 3, I do want to report for those who might be listening and interested that we're not going to be able to make it to the final item on today's agenda, which is the continued hearing on the county's conservation and open space element. So we'll probably just open that item and continue it without taking any public testimony or doing any substantive work on that item. So if you're here for that item, or you're poised and waiting to leave your house to come down here for that item, you can do something else with your afternoon because we're running far too, not that we're running behind, but our agenda was too overloaded to realistically get to that item. So where we left it on item 3, we had heard staff response to public comments, and I had offered a general response to public comments. And before we get into our deliberations, I want to ask commissioners if anyone had any other brief response to the testimony we heard this morning. I'll start on my left. Commissioner White? No. Melskow?
No.
Okay.
I did just have a couple of brief responses. And first of all, someone asked about ex parte contacts, and I did want to just announce that I did email Ms. Rolfe in the last week. I have announced ex parte contacts over the course of these ongoing discussions, 2 years-ish now. But I did email Ms. Rolfe this week and just let her know that I wasn't at all clear on the first item, the application of the MUP for single use versus many, and she emailed me back. I asked her to clarify that for all of us today, and so she's done that. She didn't respond by email, but did to the public today. I also got caught at lunch, a few ex parte contacts. Ms. Harvey, Ms. Jennings, and Ms. Casciuto all pointed out that some further notes on the LEM permit application that was brought up before lunch. They all noted separately that the permit wasn't conditioned, didn't condition the growing of a crop. We discussed the almond crop and the roses that may have been conditioned as part of the permit as kind of future agricultural use. And the point was made that they weren't conditioned as part of that permit. So I bring that up. And one last contact then with Bob Field, who's here from Santa Ynez, and he's handed me and Ms. Casciuto both copies of a letter, an article from the Santa Ynez Valley News. And so just a brief summary to let people know what that is. There may be more copies floating around if you'd like to look, but just a brief summary. Community matters. Listen closely to talk of protecting agriculture. And so it's about the ongoing struggle over this item that Santa Ynez is also seeing. And it's just talking about the long-term survival of agriculture versus a kind of short-term perspective. And so it's looking at market price of agricultural land. So it's talking about several different valuations of agricultural land: an intrinsic value, a development value, speculative value, and how that affects the long-term viability of agricultural land. Summing up, it's suggesting that it's detrimental to the long-term viability of agricultural land. Mr. Field is in the audience, and I'm sure he has more copies of this article, so if anyone's interested in seeing it, Ms. Hedges would like to put it in the record, and she will, and there are more copies floating around if anyone would like to see that. Those are my ex partes. I just wanted then to follow up on a few comments made by the public. There were several good points, so thanks everybody for coming today. Mr. Dunlop commented on the intent of our last vote from the meeting of the 30th. I would just remind everybody that what we have here is a specific interpretation of the definitions here, specifically authorized for us to hear by our land use ordinance. So again, that's very specific in our ordinance that it's our job to do here today. So I don't think we have the option of just passing it on by somehow even an intent of our last vote or anything else. Mr. Caldwell has pointed out that it's a very simple matter of permanent structures, alterations, and gradings. Grading, I would just remind everyone that's what we're here to interpret, because there are differences in interpretation between two departments here, planning and ag commissioners. I would just remind us that that's our job here, to look at those differences. It's not so simple. That's why we're spending time on this here again today. Ms. Bodrogi has suggested the importance of agritourism. I think we would all agree to that. I think there's zero dissension, zero division amongst us here today that agritourism is important to our county and our economy. I would just remind everyone the question is, what's the agra part of agritourism? We have some dissension on whether some agriculture should be required as the piece of this agritourism, and how much. So that's what we're talking about here today. We're not talking about whether some of us don't like the idea of agritourism. I have not heard that from a single one of us. I'm positive we all agree that's very important. What we don't agree on is what level of agriculture qualifies people for the tourism part. And so I hope we can stay focused on that issue now and not waste time going all over the place, because that's kind of a big one. So hopefully we'll get there soon. Ms. Sapriel is looking for legitimacy of decision. So I think going through this process, as our land use ordinance requires, is legitimacy to that decision. We're listening to everyone and we're going through the process. It's tedious, sorry. We're all worn out by it equally. Greening. Mr. Greening has commented on the appropriacy of scale and frequency. Also a question here in interpretation. We're talking about temporary events. Okay. Temporary events as opposed to ongoing uses in public assemblies, which we have a category for, public assembly. So the question is, what's temporary? I think we would all agree that temporary is more than one single thing, but is temporary things every weekend, all year, every year? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. That's also a question we need to look at. Interpretation, what are we doing? Numbers, I'll leave that alone. Numbers of vehicles, which Mr. Greening has suggested, looking at impacts. Ms. Rolfe has suggested that she's not looking for a reinterpretation, but rather that we look for an interpretational drift. And so that's what we'll be doing soon, looking at the history of this and how it goes, and the differences of opinion between our two departments, ag and planning. So we're going there.